The year is 1957. Formula One gears up for its 8th season. Juan Manuel Fangio goes into this season as the 3-time defending champion, aiming to clinch his 5th title overall. His title bid starts off with a win on home soil in January. Now, there is a 4-month-long break until the next race, the Monaco Grand Prix. What do racing drivers do when there's a gap this long in the calendar? Well, they race, of course. 1957 saw a new addition to the plethora of one-off races organized around the world, the Cuban Grand Prix, a sports car race held in the streets of Havana. In a bid to improve the image of his country and show that daily life was not affected, President Fulgencio Batista decided to bring the fastest cars and best drivers in the world together in Cuba as a way of attracting tourists and investors to boost the economy. Under his regime, Cuba became a glamorous tourist destination for the rich and the famous. What was wrong then if he was trying to cover up the reality, you might ask? Well, Batista came to power by overthrowing the government in 1933. He then became the president in 1940 for 4 years, and 8 years after that ran for presidency once again in 1952. Once it became clear that he was comfortably behind the other two candidates, he staged another military coup in 52 to seize power again. The Cuban people weren't unresponsive to this, however. The first sign of the palpable tension came already on the 26th of July 1953 when 120 young men attacked an army barracks. Batista wanted to cover up the uprisings and to show to the rest of the world that everything was under control. As for the race course, it went through the streets of the capital and was 5 kilometers long. Cars were set to reach 260 kilometers per hour or 160 miles per hour on the Malecón, the boulevard by the ocean which had the longest straight on the circuit. Safety? Well, it was an afterthought, even by the standards of motor racing in the 1950s, as this was a one-off race. There were deep gutters and pavements that were dangerously high all across the circuit, and the crowd was not protected by any means, not even by bags of sand or hay bales. Despite all that, the first Cuban Grand Prix in 1957 was a success story for Batista, with the participation of many star drivers. This first race in Cuba was all that anyone could talk about in town, from radio announcers to people seeing racing cars for the first time in their lives. And the one driver the entire crowd set their eyes on was Juan Manuel Fangio. Fangio was already a 38-year-old racer when Formula One was established as a world championship in 1950. In spite of that, he left his mark on the first decade of the new championship, and he was still considered by many to be at the top level in 57, even though he was in his mid-40s and almost doubling the age of his biggest rivals. So in Cuba 1957, Fangio was naturally the favorite to win the race. And indeed, he was the one who accepted Batista's congratulations on the podium. He went on to win the race and later that year clinch his 5th and final world championship. By the time the second Cuban Grand Prix was held in 1958, the atmosphere in the country had changed drastically. Cuba was in turmoil now. The cause of socio-economic injustice and lack of democracy was attributed by the people of Cuba to Batista and the US, which supported his regime. The army was fully under Batista's control, and this attack was followed by years of uprisings under the leadership of Fidel Castro, which by 1958 almost reached a boiling point. On the other hand, the media was tightly controlled and hard work was being done to prevent the rest of the world from knowing about these uprisings. Batista was aware of the danger, even though he tried to keep his cool. For the race weekend, each driver was given a bodyguard to accompany them. The qualifying session went without a hitch. The 46-year-old Fangio set the fastest lap time of the field against other star drivers of the day, including Phil Hill, Sterling Moss, and Wolfgang von Trips, and earned the right to start the race from the front row. However, supporters of the movement had been preparing for this weekend for months. They knew which flight Juan Manuel Fangio would take, which car he would drive in the capital city of Havana, which hotel, and even which room he would stay in. After qualifying, the time had come for the rebels. They They followed the Argentine driver back to his hotel and waited for the best moment to make their move. After Fangio arrived at the hotel, they called his room and asked to interview him as if they were a journalist. His manager, who answered the phone, politely declined the offer, saying that they would be down in the lobby shortly. This answer was actually very valuable for the rebels, because they made their preparations based on this information. 12 armed men in 3 cars approached in front of the hotel. A small part of them concealed their weapons and blended in with the crowd in the lobby, while the rest stood by the cars to make a quick escape. At 8:40 p.m., the lift doors opened and Fangio greeted and chatted with the other drivers and mechanics. After a short while, Fangio felt something pressing down on him from the side. At first, he thought he was being poked with a pen by someone asking for an autograph, but when he turned around, he realized that a lone young man with a beard, the badge of the rebels, was pointing a gun at him. "Follow me in the name of the 26th of July movement," he said. The young man's voice and hands were shaking. He turned to the friends with whom Fangio had been chatting and told them not to leave the hotel for the next 5 minutes, and that there were 4 other people waiting outside on high alert. The man then led Fangio outside to one of the cars at gunpoint. The engine was running and 2 other men were waiting for them, as well as the driver. They assured Fangio that they wouldn't do anything to him if he stayed calm, and apologized for putting him in a difficult situation. In the car, the man gave him a hat and a pair of glasses to hide his identity a little. What would you do if you were in Fangio's shoes, kidnapped by 4 men and 3 of them armed? Well, Fangio realized that these young men were extremely nervous and that the driver was going a little too fast because of his nervousness. He told his captors to calm down and told the driver to drive with more control and that he wouldn't resist. Unbelievably, though not uncharacteristically, Fangio was the calmest person around, as if he had been in a situation like this many times. Meanwhile, he was trying to understand why he'd been kidnapped. He asked if they wanted a ransom. His captors replied that he was the most important and famous person on the island right now, and that they would hold him until the start of the race the next day and then release him. They wanted to draw attention to the events that Batista was trying to cover up, just when the eyes of the whole world were on Cuba. The captors added that they would treat him with courtesy and that he was their guest. This was a good enough explanation for Fangio. He accepted the situation and simply said, "Well, this is one more adventure. If what the rebels did was for a good cause, then I accept it." Plus, if something were to happen to him, the motive of these pro-Castro rebels would suffer greatly. It was also unlikely that he would be accused of siding with them. After all, he was on their side without his own control. Now, even if the race went on, it wouldn't go on in the same way, and the same question would be on everybody's mind. What was going on in Cuba? Where was Juan Manuel Fangio? Of course, even if his captors did not intend to harm him, things could easily have gone catastrophically wrong. Soon, news of Fangio's kidnapping reached Batista and the government. A citywide search began for Fangio until the start of the race the next day. There were even door-to-door searches, but Fangio was nowhere to be found. During the 26th of July movement, which had been going on for years at this stage, there were many safe houses around the city where the revolutionaries used to hide. Fangio was taken to one of them. Not long after, he was taken in another car to another one of these houses to avoid being traced. Then, shortly after Fangio arrived, his captors removed their weapons and started preparing a meal for him. The Argentine offered his captors cigars and even signed autographs for some of them. He maintained his calm demeanor, which everyone had been used to seeing from him on track for years, throughout this extraordinary incident. Meanwhile, the other drivers, who were not even in his situation and heard the news of the events, were in shock, trying to make sure that their colleague was alright. Fangio was soon transported for the 3rd time, again in a different car, to another location. Here, after having dinner, he and his captors chatted until 1 a.m. and let off some steam. But his captors were not letting their guard down for a moment. They were aware that they were still being hunted. After Fangio had fallen asleep, 2 armed men stood guard all night long, one in front of his room and one in front of the house. In the morning, the revolutionaries also dictated 2 letters to Fangio to show the world that they had treated him well. One of the letters was addressed to the newspapers for publication, and the other to the Argentine embassy in Cuba. They also allowed him to call his family, and this time, Fangio took on the task of calming his family down. After having lunch, shortly before the start of the race, Fangio had a chat with the revolutionaries about the movement they were fighting for. They explained why they were against Batista's government and wanted to reinstate democracy, and how this kidnapping would help them gain worldwide recognition. As the start time approached, the grid began to liven up, but Fangio, the pole sitter in the Maserati, was nowhere to be seen. However, Batista was still determined to show that he had everything under control. All his forces were still searching for the 5-time world champion, and he wanted to delay the start of the race until Fangio was found. A crowd of more than 200,000 people were waiting for the race to begin, along with the 27 entrants, and after a near 2-hour delay, Batista finally conceded. The race started without Juan Manuel Fangio. For the Cuban leader and the fate of the country, this race was about to prove to be a huge turning point. In the second iteration of the race, there was absolutely nothing separating the spectators from the cars whizzing through the streets of Havana, just like the year before. But this time, disaster did strike, and as soon as the 6th lap of the 90-lap long race. A local amateur racer driving a Ferrari drove over a patch of oil spilled from another car, lost control and skidded towards the spectators. Unfortunately, 7 spectators lost their lives and more than 30 were injured. The 1958 Cuban Grand Prix was turning out to be a disaster in every sense. Perhaps Fangio had narrowly escaped being a part of this incident thanks to his kidnapping. In fact, he hadn't been satisfied with the balance of the car all season long, and the car didn't give him much confidence here either. The eventful weekend was won by Sir Sterling Moss, who was also planned to be kidnapped alongside Fangio, but Fangio talked the captors out of it by telling them that Moss was on his honeymoon, even though he knew Moss had already been to his honeymoon the year before. Now with the race over, Fangio was in more danger than ever before. It was now clear that the Batista regime were hell-bent on making the revolutionaries look bad by any means necessary. Even if Fangio was left at his hotel as normal, it was highly likely that Batista's men could attack him and blame the revolutionary movement. It was only a matter of time before Batista's men found Fangio, and so a new plan was needed. Keeping his cool in this predicament once again, Fangio asked his kidnappers to take him to the Argentine embassy. It was the only place in Cuba where he would be completely safe, and once there, Batista could do nothing to him. As such, his captors were now officially his guardians. Fangio made a phone call to the embassy, warning his contact person not to contact the police in any way. At 8:30 p.m., the embassy finally replied, "Bring Fangio at 11 o'clock." Now, for the first time, Fangio was finally showing signs of nervousness, talking to no one and pacing back and forth in the house where he was being held. When the time finally arrived, he got into the car accompanied by armed guards, and the journey to the embassy began. On the way there, they were suddenly stopped by 2 policemen. The police had stopped them to ask for a lighter. One of the guards took out a matchbox and helped the police officer light his cigarette. Fangio heard a very low but unmistakable sound from the back of the car. One of the guards sitting at the back had released the safety catch on his gun. Somehow the police officer did not hear the sound, nor did he recognize Fangio, who was wearing a hat and glasses in pitch darkness. They had dodged a bullet, both literally and figuratively, and continued on their way. And finally, 29 hours after the kidnapping, Fangio arrived safely at the embassy. As the doors opened, the fear of the ambassador and his companions was evident on their faces. And of course, Fangio once again lightened the mood by saying, "These are my friends, my kidnappers." This kidnapping went on to strengthen the motivation of the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro in the eyes of not only the country but also the whole world. And within a year, Batista's regime was overthrown. In 1959, the Cuban Grand Prix was cancelled after the Cuban Revolution was successful, and in 1960, Formula One made its last visit to Cuba, where the new regime had officially begun. Juan Manuel Fangio decided to end his racing career in 1958, that same season. The godfather of F1, as coined by Lewis Hamilton, did not visit Cuba again until the 80s, and when he finally visited the country, he reunited with his friends who had kidnapped him. The story of Juan Manuel Fangio's kidnapping during the 1958 Cuban Grand Prix is one of the most extraordinary stories in motorsport history. It emphasizes the calm and collected character of the driver, who managed to ensure his own safety and that of those around him by keeping his cool in the face of difficulties both on and off the track, making him a true legend of Formula One. I looked up this story from several resources, whose links you can also find in the description, and tried to tell it as best as I could in this video. Please let me know in the comments if there's any information that's missing or anything that's not quite correct. And with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.